afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another event of the series of Meet the Researcher of the ATHENA Monnet Fair, the US as a global actor. The chair is co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the EU, and among its main aims are to look at the multiple security crises which have led to an increased attention to the EU's role as a global actor. Among the questions we're trying to address with this chair is how can the EU become a more effective global actor and contribute to international peace and security. And my name is Dimitris Bouris, and I'm the chair holder, but with me I have Dr. Olga Burliuk, who is a senior researcher in the chair, and we are doing this work together. This is the Meet the Researcher series, and the idea of this series is to meet distinguished researchers and to discuss with them aspects related to their research, how they conduct their research, what approaches they use, what case studies they use, and what questions guide their research. And I'm very happy to have with us today Dr. Vjosa Musliu, who is an assistant professor of international relations at the VUB. Her research interests include international and European interventions, conflicts, as well as international political economy. Her area of focus is primarily the Balkans and the post-Soviet space. Vjosa is a co-editor of the Routledge series of studies in intervention and state building, and she is also the co-founder of the Yugoslav Women Plus Collective. She was previously a postdoctoral researcher of the FWO at the VUB, and her project dealt with Europe and Europeanization as performative acts in everyday events, a work which I have to admit I'm a big fan of as well. Prior to joining their team at VUB, Professor Musliu has been a postdoc at the Conflict and Development Department of Ghent University, and also a lecturer at Kent University, Brussels School of International Studies. Vjosa, thank you for being with us and welcome to this online event. And I guess I want to start by taking you a little bit back. I would just like to know a little bit about your background, what made you decide to pursue a PhD, what was the topic of your PhD, and what kind of approaches and methods did you use?
Thank you, Dimitris, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm also very glad to be with you today and talk about research and the approaches and the methods that I have been using so far. To go back to your question, it is indeed quite a long time ago. So in my PhD, I specifically looked at the way how international interventions have been legitimized, used, and also reproduced in the case of Kosovo and to some extent in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina as well. Since 1999 onwards, for those of you not familiar with it, Kosovo has had the wider spectrum of interventions from structures of liberal interventionism. So there has been a NATO bombing against, well, officially Yugoslavia, but what had remained of it, essentially Serbia. And after that, there has been shuttle diplomacy before and after that ended the war and turned Kosovo into a de facto protectorate of the United Nations. So then there was a deployment of the United Nations mission in Kosovo together with NATO troops, NATO ground troops that were deployed in Kosovo. So there were already two very core and traditional aspects and structures of interventionism. And following that, there was, again, shuttle diplomacy run by the Troika, so representatives of Russia, EU, and the US, and also a UN envoy to negotiate between Kosovo and Serbia, unable to find an agreement. Kosovo declares its independence from Serbia in 2008, and then that paves the way for the deployment of the European Union rule of law mission in Kosovo, which is the biggest and most expensive EU mission to date. So all of these aspects have made Kosovo as such like a very typical case study, so to speak, of international interventions and processes of Europeanization, but also of international law. So many have looked at the way how these missions, sometimes overlapping missions with UN mandates or without UN mandates, have been operating and intervening in Kosovo. And of course, having been born and brought up in Kosovo for, well, up until my adult life, I was naturally interested in the topic. I had been in Kosovo when the war had started, when the interventions, the NATO intervention airstrikes happened, also when the war ended, so when those NATO troops just poured into the country, ending the war. And then all of these missions, they have been part of my upbringing. So it was almost natural that I would end up studying this topic. But then once I started to read the literature, so when I came to the universities, so after my bachelor degree, I realized that the majority of the literature on intervention and state building was first of all, it was primarily written by scholars who have never experienced war or peace or civil frictions, but they had very bold arguments of what peace is, what intervention is, what war is. So that was the first, let's say, clash, methodological and more epistemological clash I had, because I was coming with this very embodied understanding of how war looks like and what it does to populations. And then there was, of course, all these nice and interesting concepts that were trying to make sense of something that was rather not always easy to make sense of. And most of this literature that I was reading was also done very much from the perspective of geopolitics. So in what sphere of influence would eventually Kosovo and the Balkans be? Will it, be more under the influence of Russia or presumably Turkey, as opposed to the EU and the US? So the region as such, and also Kosovo as a country in particular, were not seen as subjects with their own agency and subjectivity, but they were studied under this framework of being satellites of one part or another. And that was also something I had epistemological difficulties to come to terms with. So a lot of what I did in my PhD was indeed to try and go against that grain and try to really understand what has happened in the ground. So I did a lot of ethnographic research. I did site visits for my PhD, site visits that would include going to different cities and areas populated by Serbs, by Roma, by Turks, talking to these people, talking to different demographics, so people who worked with international organizations, i.e. people who were paid very well, comparatively speaking, and what kind of vision they had, as opposed to farmers and teachers in some remote towns. So I did that coupled with interviews and a lot of media review, but all of this spectrum of the methods that I chose was a direct influence from what I saw was missing in the literature. Because, like I said, most of this literature was done primarily by international scholars who not always could reach as easily to all of these demographics, because you have to speak the languages as well, Albanian, Serbian, other languages, but you also have to know a little bit the sociopolitical realities in the ground. And that was my main motivation behind it. And I used a lot of these, what at that time I learned to call interpretive methods in international relations and political science, as opposed to more, let's say, positivist, traditional, i.e. traditional research methods of trying to make sense of a particular concept or reality.
Thank you, Vjosa. I think this gives us a very good idea of what was the starting point? And I think it's also good to reflect on these kind of issues in the literature, who produces the literature, who writes on something, and their positionality as well. I do understand the reasons why you decided to focus on Kosovo, to focus on what happened with the international community. And among your first publications were these two articles on deconstructing and defining ULEX, and also a constructivist read of the EU's agenda centric in Kosovo. Why these two particular topics? And you hinted a little bit on ULEX, that it's the biggest and most expensive mission which the EU has deployed, but I'm sure there were other reasons behind this choice. And you also referred to the research methods you used for this. I was wondering if you could delve a little bit more into detail on these methods.
I will try. So the first two articles, the article that essentially takes a constructivist approach to understand the deployment and the functioning of the European Union's rule of law mission in Kosovo, called EULEX. This was directly an article derived from my master thesis. So much like yourselves, I wrote a master thesis on EU's actorness, on a topic related to EU's actorness abroad. And I specifically took the case of EULEX to see how this manifests EU's actorness in the world as a case study. So there was a case study, so a very traditionalist approach, a case study. I did media review, press releases of the EU mission in Kosovo, an analysis of those, a framing analysis. And I try to understand in the way how EULEX press releases were organized and what kind of language they were narrating and producing. Based on those, I then try to analyze what kind of an actor EU wants to be perceived as abroad. And then in addition to analyzing these press releases of the EU mission, I also did interviews with both EU officials and civil society actors in Kosovo. So after doing the framing analysis of the press releases, then I went and interviewed, I believe, around 15 EU officials at that time working in Kosovo. These were mainly people working with judges, prosecutors, press office in the EU mission, but also people who did like project management as well, custom officials as well. And then I talked to civil society members in Kosovo, both Albanians and Serbs, to try and see how do they see EU's actorness and what the EU is doing in Kosovo as displaying a kind of an image of EU's actorness. And then I tried to analyze these two, so the interviews of EU officials and the press releases from the EU mission, in not necessarily in a battle of narratives with the locals discourse, but trying to bring them more into a conversation and see what each of them had to say about what the EU is doing and what kind of an actor the EU is. And that became the theory that I chose for this. My first go-to as a master's student at that time was constructivism, because that seemed like the most the theory with the most potential, where I could dig into elements of subjectivity and intersubjectivity as well. And I tried to take a look to a variety of constructivists and varieties of schools of inside constructivism as well. So that ended up being this particular article. And then that took me later on to deconstruction, which was a completely different method. This is the time when I discover, and I have this major breakthrough when I discover interpretive methods. that are more rooted in intersubjectivity, reflexivity, and positionality. So the basic why I had a breakthrough was that throughout my entire education, I was told that it takes a researcher with a sound detachment from the object of study to make sense of a reality in a neutral, objective, and universally applicable form of a knowledge production. And the interpretivists, on the other hand, gave me this entire new understanding, in the sense that for them, there was no such thing as a completely detached researcher from the object of study in social sciences, because we are not operating in a lab where we take a frog and we dissect it and we look where is the kidney and how does it function. We go and we observe social realities, and social realities are a bit more complicated than specimen that we see in labs. And to that end, they require different methodologies. And that required that you admit your own biases. And here you can think of my own biases as being from there, like being ethnic, linguistic biases, cultural maybe, but also like very, let's say, benign biases that we think of. We all go to the field and we all try to make sense of the reality from a particular viewpoint, depending on our class, socioeconomic status, the types of families we grew up in, etc. All of these influence the way how we perceive the world. And in interpretive research methods, the idea was that we have to be cognizant of these biases and be reflexive about them and engage with the discussion how they influence our field work or our ethnographic work or what have you. And in this period, then I try to deconstruct in a way. I use the methods, I use the readings of Jacques Derrida. This is also what my PhD was based on. So it was an entire discussion of aporias from ancient Greek, hospitality, the notion of hospitality, the notion of autoimmunity. And I use this, so the works of Derrida, the quintessential post-structuralist, to make sense of the new sets of intervention in Kosovo. So in a way, I started with the idea of constructing things, but then very soon I was provoked by the idea to interrogate, because to deconstruct essentially means to critically interrogate a particular subject or a notion in place. And that's where the second article that Dimitris asked about stems from.
Thank you, Vjosa. I mean, you brought up a number of very important issues and topics like subjectivity and intersubjectivity, observing social realities, and also realizing that there is not, that our positionalities also affect the way that we do research. And what I liked in what you said is that we need to reflect on this. There is not such a thing as, you know, objectivity. Everything is subjective and everything is open to interpretation. But we also need to reflect on our own positionalities, our own biases based on the background of how we grew up, you know, socioeconomic background, cultural background, if you want to call it gender as well. Background.
Yeah.
And you talked a lot about frame analysis and frames, and you also touched upon the idea of narratives. And I know that you have used this scholarship for your own research, the scholarship on narratives. How is this research on narratives different or complementary to the frame analysis that you did before that research? In other words, I'm trying to see how you evolved as a researcher, not only in what kind of topics you research, but also in the kind of methods and literatures you used. So how did you move from the frame analysis to narratives?
Yeah. Well, there are a good amount of years in between, but I think as many of us in this virtual room, I was also trained in very traditional methods. So you have the element of objectivity and that detachment was very core to my scholarly upbringing. So there was always this idea that you write in passive voice, that you never use the word I think, I argue. So it's always, and you need to always, let's say, put yourself behind the entire process of writing, right? And of course, I had to do that because much like the master thesis, the PhD dissertation as well has a certain officialdom. So you need to comply with certain rules. But then, like, it is important to, as we, and I call this meta thinking. So as we think about what we are observing, to also be able to think of how are we thinking at this very moment? With what kinds of tools or language or frames are we thinking through this? And I always thought all of these observations I had done during my field work, during site visits, during interviews, there was a lot of anecdotal evidence, a lot of feelings that are associated with being in the field, with talking to the people. And only a fraction of that raw data made it to my dissertation, made it in the frame analysis, because these were like very well designed models. You know, there are tables, you draw some arrows and you try to explain how this concept relates to the other. But then there was all of this background, all of this, the chunk of fieldwork evidence that never saw the light of the publication, because naturally my supervisor said, you know, this is too anecdotal, or it looks a lot like your diary, so, you know, remove it from there. And I always thought there has to be a way how to transfer this into knowledge, because this is important. Like, there was no other way how I could explain how it felt to go from one city to another, sometimes with a public transportation, sometimes with an illegal taxi, sometimes with the escort of a police, because, you know, you were navigating different kinds of zones inside the country. Now, frame analysis and all those tables and nice boxes did not allow me to bring all of this urgency that field work naturally gives it to you. And then I dug a little bit more into, you know, different kinds of methods, and I discovered this narrative research and autoethnography. And this is where the article that I think Dimitri's question is stemming from was written about. So years after I finished my PhD, I went back to my fieldwork notes and I wrote about what it meant to go as a researcher, to do fieldwork, to talk to people who have been plagued by the war, by peace processes, who have been left unemployed, etc., and who are dealing now with sets of diplomatic negotiations, and what it meant for them. But also what it meant for me as a researcher to navigate my own positionality, bias, because when you go to a specific field, especially when it's a contentious issue, when it's something that affects directly the lives of people, and these are usually topics that we grapple with, they also affect us. But there was no way how to turn that into knowledge. And by writing this autoethnographic piece, by looking at how the narratives of these people were told to me, I wanted to do justice to that part of the fieldwork that otherwise would have just been left unexplored, or at the very least, you know, it would have seemed as if it is an unimportant element of the field work.
Thank you, Vjosa. And I do agree with this notion that the I is missing from our work largely, and this has to do with how we write our publications, a journal article, a book. A lot of times the person is missing from all this work, at least for political scientists, not for the anthropologists or the sociologists, but for political scientists, unfortunately, this is missing. And I guess this I and what you've been discussing is what led you to write that article on memory, home, and fieldwork, right? Could you tell us? I have read this article several times, and I really like it. Could you tell us a little bit more about this article?
So the article was published, I think, in 2017, and it's called Notes on Fieldwork, Memory and Home. And it talks about my fieldwork session in northern Mitrovica, which is a city primarily inhabited by the Serbs. And at that time, when I did the field work, this was 2013. So I published the article 4 years after that. Also to show you that with research and with writing and with rewriting, you really have to be patient. You know, nobody learned how to do this in a matter of months. And I think you can also cut yourselves some slack if you're being too harsh on yourselves as well. It does take quite some time. The article explains in an autoethnographic fashion. So I talk a lot about, you know, I'm going here, you know, this is, I'm taking the bus, I'm trying to go to northern Mitrovica. And at that time, the city is, let's say, not necessarily blocked, but it is advisable not to go there if you are not a local Serb. I had already arranged some interviews from Belgium. I had emailed some civil society activists in the north of Kosovo, some Serbian civil society activists from my Belgian email address that I want to come and to do interviews. Now, because I had emailed them from a Belgian email address, you know, .be, they never thought that I am actually from Kosovo and that I am an Albanian. So when I try to go there, I arrive in the south part of the city, which is inhabited by Albanians. So the city has been divided after the war by a bridge. The northern part is inhabited by the Serbs, the southern part is inhabited by Albanians. And I'm trying to reach out to local people. You know, I go to a coffee bar, you know, all composed by, all clientele is men. You know, they look at me very strangely, obviously, because one, I am a woman. Two, I am clearly not a woman from there because, you know, it does not seem like a, you know, women-friendly environment, that particular cafe. And I'm, you know, running around tables to try and gather, like, look, I want to go to the north, but there is no taxi driver is agreeing to take me there. And they look at me very strangely, as in, you know, have you just landed from Mars? Of course, you cannot go up north because, you know, we are basically at war. Like, we don't go to the north. You know, we were chased from the north down south. And I'm like, no, but you don't understand. I need to do research. Like, but if you are employed from a Belgian university, maybe they should provide for your security, or NATO should accompany you there. And I simply could not believe that, you know, we're talking about a distance of like tops 15 minutes walk. So really, really close. And I could not imagine myself with NATO soldiers, you know, on a hunt going there to do what is, after all, an academic like purpose. I'm going to interview civil society actors. I'm not going into a war zone. So seeing that they were not willing to help, then in the article, I explained how I went to this office that was in the middle of the southern part and the northern part. So it was like, I think, some form of a public institution. And I went there to inquire about information, like, look, I'm this researcher, I work with this Belgian university, I came to do field work and I need to go up north. Like all of them, all of these clerks who were working there advised me strongly not to go there, and especially not to go there unaccompanied. This is also where you see how all these gender aspects are also coming very much to the fore. Like gender and ethnic, one, you're not a Serbian, so it's extremely difficult and dangerous for you to be there. Two, you're a woman, and three, you're an unaccompanied woman. So like I was naturally, I had a research plan, all right? So like for me, it was very important to be diligent to my research. I need to go to the north and I need to do my job. But this is what I thought in 2013. This is what I was doing. Fast forward years later, when I decided to write this autoethnography, I also started to understand that this was not just field work. I was really not dying to go to the north just for field work. I was also willingly seeking to confront something that, you know, at one time has been very traumatic, but, you know, that you have never had any closure moment. You know, I wanted to see what that environment is like, you know, where Serbs live, you know, things have changed so much before the war, after the war, that I wanted to see how that looks like, one, and what impact it would have on me. But of course, in the moment when I was doing field work, I really hid behind the methods, like I have this many interviews to do and I need to go up north. So then I got some clerk, I think, followed me outside and actually gave me almost in secret the phone number of some illegal taxi driver, and said to me, please drop me a message on this phone number when you get there. And that's when I started to also be afraid a little bit, because otherwise, what kind of a motive did this clerk have to follow me outside, hand me secretly this phone number, and tell me, I hope you stay safe? So anyway, I went up north and I talked to civil society members from the Serbian population, and everything seemed to be, to make sense after that. So it was this moment when you realize that the struggles up north are just like almost the same as the struggles down south. People are struggling with unemployment, with bad public services. Of course, at the backdrop of all of this are the political issues. But then you realize that unless you go there and you understand this from the source, it is natural that those people, like half an hour walk from there, were so afraid, because if you've never dared to go up north or down south, you really create this boogeyman of a subject that you're afraid of. And these are issues that I talk about in the article, and what they meant to me as a researcher, and how field work can be complicated, not only when you are so personally involved, like myself in this case, but also simply if you care enough, or if you are involved in one way or another with a particular topic, or with a particular subject. If you read interpretivists in political science, you see, for instance, how many of them have done field work in these massive industrial farmhouses or slaughterhouses, while at the same time the research has been vegetarian. But you have to do field work at ethnography there, and you have to sit there as they chop and slaughter animals, which is very much against everything you stand for. But at the same time, you're a researcher, and you have to take both of those into account and navigate the fine line between the two.
I have two more questions, and then we can open up to our students. The next question is that you have also done a lot of research on issues related to sovereignty and also local critiques of intervention and state building. Could you tell us a little bit more about this kind of research?
So the literature in interventions and state building towards the end of 2000s started to have this turn, or this wave of research that was focusing on the local turn. They were calling it the local turn. The idea was to take a closer look to what the local subjects who are affected by interventions, by state building, or by warfare, by peace agreements, make of it and have to say about it, both as subjects of research. So the local turn meant primarily to go to the field and actually talk to the people, so bringing the local in, but also turning the gaze to local productions, local knowledge production on the very issues that were being discussed. And as I explained earlier, I had already been perplexed by the political economy of knowledge production in intervention and state building. Just to also give you a bit of a broader overview, and I am taking this directly from the works of Ramon Grossvogel, who is also a decolonial thinker and academic. The literature that we read in political science and international relations, so the very canons of this knowledge production, are produced from scholars of 6 Western and European countries: US, Canada, UK, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany. Most of these subjects who write and produce knowledge are, of course, men, most of them, or almost exclusively white men. So what passes for universal knowledge on intervention, state building, IR, foreign policy is produced in barely a fraction of what the world is from a very specific demographics of academics. So when the turn to the local announced itself, there was a lot of excitement, and having acknowledged some of the problems I evidenced in the literature at the beginning, I also embarked on this movement to try and see how locals were reading or criticizing, or criticizing as in, critically interrogating, deconstructing international interventions and state building in Kosovo. And together with a colleague from the Dublin City University, we co-edited a volume that looks specifically on the local critiques of state building in Kosovo. And we gathered a lot of these local scholars from Kosovo or based abroad, but originally from Kosovo, and try to understand what kind of knowledge they would produce and what kind of critiques they would produce on intervention. Now, again, to go back to Grossvogel, he talks about the universal university. So when he says that the knowledge is produced by white men scholars of 5 or 6 Western and European countries, he says that this is then given, rendered, and reproduced as the universal form of knowledge production. So when you study IR, you read primarily the same literature, irrespective of whether you're studying in Amsterdam, in Argentina, in Tokyo, or in Ghana. This is what the corpus of IR literature looks like. So, this is the very universal knowledge production. And what we try to do with Gazim Vjosa, who is the co-author of that edited volume, is also try to break this homogeneous demographics of who produces knowledge and try to bring into these local critiques. And we realized that even in the local critiques, the most, let's say, advanced critical framework that even local scholars were coming with did not surpass Foucault. Michel Foucault, who is a French thinker, again, very much a Western-based framework of criticizing something. But so this goes to show the extent of that universal university, the universal knowledge production that is not just in terms of creating the facts and providing the narrative, but also providing the very tools through which we criticize that as well. And we did reflect about this in the conclusion of the edited volume, that we need to be a bit more aware and not to romanticize the local as well, because the local is also part of this global trend. If we read the same authors from Argentina to Tokyo and from Accra to Stockholm, we might as well produce the very same knowledge and more or less the very same critique.
Thank you, Vjosa. That's an excellent kind of reflection. And I also know the work of Gazim, and I appreciate his work a lot too. All this brings me to your recently published monograph on Europeanization and state building as everyday practices, performing Europe in the Western Balkans, which personally I have really enjoyed reading. Could you give us some more insights on the conceptual framework of this work, as well as the research methods you used for it?
Thank you. Yeah, gladly. So this is the book, Europeanization and State Building as Everyday Practices, is part of a bigger project I was working on. I tried to understand how Europeanization functions as an everyday event and how it impacts sociological, cognitive, and cultural change. So how are Europeans engineered, made because of processes of Europeanization? The drive behind, so the conceptual dilemma from which the book stems from, is that processes of Europeanization, as well as European integration or globalization, have largely been studied and critiqued as these macro projects or macro concepts that are too slippery, too difficult to grasp, but we see them as totalizing projects that change fundamentally the entire setting or the entire society. And I wanted to be able to break down processes of Europeanization and see how they manifest themselves as everyday practices. And again, this is where my background comes to the fore, because in countries like Georgia, Ukraine, and Kosovo, Ukraine before the war, Europe Day, for instance, is a public holiday. You don't get to go to work because, you know, these countries really want to show that they are European or that they have a pro-European vocation. In the meantime, I work in Brussels, the very capital of the European Union, and here that is not a public holiday. What is more, every time I would do this exercise with my students, most of them EU citizens, most of them would not even know when Europe Day is to begin with. But Georgians, Ukrainians, Kosovans seem to be quite in tune with that. And later on through research, I realized that while these countries celebrate Europe Day and have it as public holiday, Europe Day is celebrated for the entire month of May in Peru. And I thought, okay, this is weird because, okay, Georgia really wants to become a member of the European Union. So does Ukraine, Kosovo as well, for obvious reasons. But why do Peruvians have to celebrate Europe Month every May, now like every single year? So I went and did field work in Peru for 3 months, and I tried to understand why they do this. And then COVID interrupted things, so the project got stopped there. But the book talks about how, for instance, events such as Europe Day or some civil society training that is organized by EU officials, or a certain competition that is financed and directed by the EU, or some revitalization of a space, of a public space financed by the EU, can be seen to understand how Europeanization works as a daily practice, and how people, so subjects who are exposed to this, then take notions of what Europe is and what Europeanization should look like. Now, I have looked at Europeanization as an everyday practice in the cases of Bosnia and Herzegovina, North Macedonia, Kosovo, and Albania. And I have looked, for instance, how the city of Tirana, the capital of Albania, and the city of Skopje, capital of North Macedonia, have been entirely changed, revitalized, some would say metamorphosed, in dubious processes of money laundering, among other things, in the name of Europeanization. How entire marathons in the city are also carried out in the name of Europe, and how you see that all of these little events that are used from political elites take the banner of Europeanization because they essentially legitimize these projects. In the case of Kosovo, for instance, I have looked how we can understand Europeanization as an everyday practice if you look at the Pride Parade of the LGBT plus community that takes place every year. What do I mean by that? Well, I was reading in the literature constantly that, among what is an otherwise rather homophobic region, Kosovo scored very high in terms of being on the, let's say, on the extreme side of homophobic setup country. But at the same time, it was also the only country that would organize pride parades without any incidents, where everything seemed to be, going perfectly well. There were no religious or conservative or nationalist groups that were coming with a counter protest. Not even policemen were, guarding, creating corridors like you would have in Belgrade, for instance. And I thought, okay, something is rather wrong here. So this is where I then went to anthropology and sociology and borrowed their methods. I borrowed their multi-sited ethnography to be able, and brought it into IR, brought it to European studies, to be able to go to the field and try to understand how does something like that happen. And when I went to the field, I understood that all of this exercise is also done in the name of Europeanization, in the name of showing that you want to be pro-European, but at the same time, stemming from a very self-orientalizing paradigm, when you want to show that you are European, you're at the same time trying to show that you're not Balkan anymore, or that you're not traditionally Balkan, so typically associated with masculine powers, machism, conservatism, and these traditional values. So I could see how the political elites, but also civil society actors in Kosovo, but also in the region writ large, were using these processes to convey themselves as Europeans. So in these activities, in these everyday performances, they were sending messages to Brussels of what kind of political elites and what kind of populations they are having or they are engineering. This led me to be able to sort of break down a bit otherwise these technical processes of how Europeanization works or how processes of European integration influence populations in the ground.
Thank you so much, Vjosa. Are there any questions from the students?
Question. So
Go ahead.
I'm curious if performativity can be applied. So I want to use this concept and look at Transnistria by looking at this concept, but I want to look at how a national identity is being constructed and like kind of like a new ethnic category is being created by the Transnistrian. Not created, but how is the narrative constructed, the one that justifies the existence of the Transnistrian nation? And I want to look at it, and it's like, do you have any advice for using this conceptual framework, but without referring to Europeanization necessarily, so referring more to like the nation building side of the debate?
Yes, thank you, George, for the question. Obviously, this is not a concept that is birthed, so to speak, by Europeanization literature. Far from it. We had to bring it from completely different disciplines. In that sense, it is very adjustable to different, even if you are looking at the way how, for instance, certain legislation on queer rights is given, legislated, or legitimized, you can use performativity to essentially problematize how these processes take place. In the same vein, I think, especially if you want to showcase how a redefined form of ethnic or cultural identity in Transnistria is being, so to speak, not constructed, but maybe given forward, I think there is a lot of room and potential to bring notions of performativity to it. Because much like I explained in the book, this is not the performativity is not performance as such. So there is an ingrained understanding, or there is an ingrained element that make it partly genuine, for the lack of a better word, but at the same time also pragmatically staged and pragmatically used. So performativity would allow you then, George, to be able to show, one, how this takes place. So what kind of Transnistrian, what kind of identity is being performed? So what kind of values or what kind of oppositions or contradictions they are trying to show or to oppose? And at the same time, also what kind of a project is it trying to legitimize? Because part of it is, of course, ingrained. There is identities are, to begin with, fluid, but the way how they are performed by looking at the concept of performativity would then allow us to see to what extent this is staged, performed, but also it can sometimes be a sheer performance as well. Like in the book, you will see that there are cases in the Western Balkans when what Judith Butler means with performativity is, strictly speaking, a theatrical performance, so, the curtains fall and you have the performance is finished. To give you an example, what do I mean by that? For instance, it is somewhat of a sheer performance when a former senior Kosovo leader would come at the front of the Pride Parade to show that, he protects this sexual minority and he's right behind them. And then the very next day, he would go to the office and unleash a very homophobic comment, because this is essentially what he thinks, right? Now, this has nothing to do with what Judith Butler is talking to us about performativity, when we are trying to legitimize and justify. So that blur between performance and genuinity is completely disbalanced here. This is sheer performance. Now, I don't know much about the case itself, or whether you would look at it from the discourse of certain political leaders or academics or intellectuals or population at large, but it might be beneficial to look at the types of narratives or justifications or the choice of words that they are using, or the types of actions that they are taking place. I don't know, the waving of a particular flag or of a particular slogan, and how that is used to show a distinction in terms of ethnic identity.
Can I also ask something about methodology?
Yeah.
Would you say interviews are good for creating a framework for analysis, or would you say it's better to use, for example, discourse analysis and then use interviews to kind of like confirm or infirm what you already found out based on the conceptual framework of performativity?
I think they would have to be, they would have to inform one another. So you would have to look, especially if you're opting for using performativity in the way how, let's say, the reworkings of Derrida or Judith Butler would take it, then I think there needs to be a communication in between the two. So it's not like in a very traditional setting where you would say you do the discourse analysis from your desk research and then you go to the interviews to confirm or disprove that, you know. This is, so the logic of cause effects or drawing causal mechanisms in between, that does not quite fit in this. So if you want to understand how, let's say, a new Transnistrian identity is performed, so the performativity of a new Transnistrian identity, then I would say you bring into conversation, you bring into tension the speech acts, so the discourse analysis and the data that you have from the interviews. And you try to understand how a new identity is being performed in the convergence of these two. But it's not, there are no formulas, I would say, I may be wrong in this, but I don't think there are formulas that would show you that you either prove or disprove one set of data with another.
Thank you, Vjosa, for your response. And I guess you are also tired after this hour. So I would like to thank you a lot for being with us today, for sharing some of your experiences with us. It's been a pleasure hosting you in the framework of this Meet the Researcher series. And I also hope to have the opportunity to meet you in person. For my students who are here, Vjosa will be coming in May to give a guest lecture in Amsterdam. So I'll keep everyone updated about this. And I also hope that I will have the opportunity to meet you in person in May. Thank you for making the time to be with us today, and for all your openness and for sharing your thoughts and talking to us about your research.
Thank you very much for having me, Dimitris, and for everybody who showed up today. I'd love to meet every one of you, and of course you, Dimitris, on the 11th of May. I will be coming to your university for a guest lecture. So even if you were too tired or distracted today, I'd be happy to take some of your questions in May when I will be there in person.